Dragonsong by Anne McCaffrey, Chapter 1, Part 1. Drummer, beat, and piper, blow, harper, strike, and soldier, go, free the flame, and sear the grasses, till the dawning red star passes. Almost as if the elements, too, mourned the death of the gentle old harper, a southeaster blew for 3 days, locking even the burial barge inside the safety of the dock cavern. The storm gave seaholder Janus too much time to brood over his dilemma. It gave him time to speak to every man who could keep rhythm and pitch. They all gave him the same answer. They couldn't properly honor the old harper with his death song, but Manali could. To which answer Janus would grunt and stamp off. It rankled in his mind that he couldn't give voice to his dissatisfaction with that answer, and his frustration. Manali was the only girl, too tall and lanky to be a proper girl at that. It galled him to have to admit that. Unfortunately, she was the only person in the entire half-circle sea-hold who could play any instrument as well as the old harper. Her voice was true, her fingers clever on string, stick, or pipe, and she knew the death song. For all Janus could be certain, the aggravating child had been practicing that song ever since old Petteran had started burning with his fatal fever. She will have to do the honor, Janus, his wife, Mavi, told him the evening the storm began to slacken. The important thing is that Petteran is properly sung to rest. One does not have to record who did the singing. The old man knew he was dying. Why didn't he instruct one of the men? Because, replied Mavi, with a touch of sharpness in her voice, you would never spare him a man when there was fishing. There was young Tranalty, whom you sent fostering to Sea-hold. Couldn't that young lad of Feroltz? His voice is changing. Come, Janus, it'll have to be Manali. Janus grumbled bitterly against the inevitable as he climbed into the sleeping furs. That's what everyone else has told you, haven't they? So why make so much of a necessity? Janus settled himself, resigned. The fishing will be good tomorrow, his wife said, yawning. She preferred him fishing to stomping around the hold, sullen and critical, with enforced inactivity. She knew he was the finest sea-holder half-circle had ever had. The hold was prospering, with plenty for bartering set by in the storage caves. They hadn't lost a ship or a man in several turns either, which said much for his weather wisdom. But Janus, at home, on a heaving deck in foul weather, was very much adrift when taxed with the unexpected on land. Mavi was keenly aware that Janus was displeased with his youngest child. Mavi found the girl exasperating, too. Manali worked hard and was very clever with her fingers, too clever by half when it came to playing any instrument in the harper craft. Perhaps, Mavi thought, she had not been wise to permit the girl to linger in the old harper's constant company once she had learned all the proper teaching songs. But it had been one less worry to let Manali nurse the old harper, and Petteran had wished it. No one begrudged a harper's requests. Ah, well, thought Mavi, dismissing the past, there would be a new harper soon, and Manali could be put to tasks proper to a young girl. The next morning the storm had cleared off, the skies were cloudless, the sea calm. The burial barge had been outfitted in the dock cavern, Petteran's body wrapped in harper blue on the tilter board. The entire fleet and most of the sea-hold followed in the wake of the oar-driven barge out into the faster-moving current above Narat Deep. Manali on the barge prow sang the elegy, her clear, strong voice carrying back to the half-circle fleet, the men chanting the descant as they rowed the barge. On the final chord, Petteran went to his rest. Manali bowed her head and let the drumstick slide from her fingers into the sea. How could she ever use them again when they had beaten Peterin's last song? She had held back her tears since the harper had died, because she knew she had to be able to sing his elegy, and you couldn't sing with the throat closed from crying. Now the tears ran down her cheeks, mingled with sea spray, her sobs punctuated by the soft chant of the steersman setting about. Petterin had been her friend, her ally and mentor. She had sung from the heart as he'd taught her, from the heart and gut. Had he heard her song where he had gone? She raised her eyes to the palisades of the coast, to the white-sanded harbor between the two arms of Half-Circle Hold. The sky had wept itself out in the past 3 days, a fitting tribute. The air was cold. She shivered in her thick, wear-hide jacket. She would have some protection from the wind if she stepped down into the cockpit with the oarsmen, but she couldn't move. Honor was always accompanied by responsibility, and it was fitting for her to remain where she was until the burial barge touched the sterns of Dock Cavern. Half-Circle Hold would be lonelier than ever for her now. Petterin had tried so hard to live long enough for his replacement to arrive. He'd told Manali he wouldn't last the winter. He'd dispatched a message to Master Harper Robinson to send a new harper as soon as possible. He'd also told Manali that he'd sent 2 of her songs to the Master Harper. "Women can't be harpers," she'd said to Petterin, astonished and awed. 1 in 10,000 have perfect pitch, Petterin had said in one of his evasive replies. 1 in 10,000 can properly build an acceptable melody with meaningful words. Were you only a lad, there would be no problem at all. Well, we're stuck with me being a girl. You'd make a fine, big, strong lad, you would, Petterin had replied exasperatingly. And what's wrong with being a fine, big, strong girl? Manali had been half teasing, half annoyed. Nothing, surely nothing. And Petterin had patted her hands, smiling at her. She'd been helping him eat his dinner. His hands, so crippled even the lightest wooden spoon left terrible ridges in the swollen fingers. And Master Harper Robinson's a fair man. No one on Pern can say he isn't, and he'll listen to me. He knows his duty, and I am, after all, a senior member of the craft hall, being taught up in the craft before him himself, and I'll require him to listen to you. Have you really sent him those songs you made me wax down on slates? I have. Sure I have done that much for you, dear child. He had been so emphatic that Manali had to believe that he'd done what he said. Poor old Petterin. In the last months he'd not remembered the time of turn, much less what he'd done the day before. He was timeless now, Manali told herself, her wet cheeks stinging with cold, and she'd never forget him. The shadow of the 2 arms of Half-Circle's cliffs fell across her face. The barge was entering the home harbor. She lifted her head. High above, she saw the diminutive outline of a dragon in the sky. How lovely! And how had Bendon Weir known? No, the dragon rider was only doing a routine sweep. With thread falling at unexpected times, dragons were often flying above Half-Circle, isolated as it was by the bogs at the top of Nerat Bay. No matter, the dragon was awing above Half-Circle Hold at this appropriate moment, and that was, to Manali, the final tribute to Petterin the harper. The men lifted the heavy oars out of the water, and the barge glided slowly to its mooring at the far end of the dock. Fort and Telek might boast of being the oldest sea holds, but only Half-Circle had a cavern big enough to dock an entire fishing fleet and keep it safe from threadfall and weather. Dock Cavern had moorings for 30 boats, storage for all the nets, traps, and lines, airing racks for sails, and a shallow ledge where hulls could be scraped free of sea growths and repaired. At the very end of the immense cavern was a shelf of rock where the hole's builders worked when there was sufficient timber for a new hole. Beyond was the small inner cave where priceless wood was stored, dried on high racks or warped into frames. The burial barge lightly touched its pier. Manali? The first oarsman held out a hand to her. Startled by the unexpected courtesy to a girl her age, she was about to jump down, when she saw in his eyes the respect due her at this moment, and his hand, closing on hers, gave silent approval for her singing of the harper's elegy. The other men stood, too, waiting for her to disembark first. She straightened her shoulders, although her throat felt too tight enough from her tears, and she stepped proudly down to the solid stone.